So, Nancy, as I understand it, there's two provisions of this law, and there's kind of a bipartisan split on it. Democrats mainly object to the fact that these platforms are not held liable for content that appears on their site. Republicans don't like the Good Samaritan, quote unquote, part of it that at least lets the companies police that content somewhat. Which of these two planks is most likely to be changed, if either, do you think?
Both. I think what we're actually looking at now is potentially an overhaul of Section 230 altogether. You're perfectly right to mention that there are these two provisions. Those two provisions were always meant to affect a sort of balance, so that companies would be incentivized to take a light touch approach to policing their platforms, so they don't completely stay away from deciding what appears on their platforms, but they're also not going to be held legally liable if they do kind of stick their hands in and kind of clean it up a bit. The thinking now is that the companies have kind of abused that privilege that was given to them by the law, and so there's a complete rethinking of, okay, how do we structure this thing so that the companies have to take some responsibility, whether it's on the Democratic side worrying about misleading ads, for example, or on the Republican side, they complain a lot about allegations of bias in how those platforms are moderated. The push right now is just to say to these companies, hey, you need to take more responsibility. What that looks like isn't exactly clear yet.
And if the companies, Nancy, are taking more responsibility, that's going to cost them a lot of money. It's going to mean a lot of lawyers, I'm sure, potentially a lot of lobbying as this plays out. And I'm also just wondering, I mean, this was the law that passed in 1996 that gave rise to the internet as we know it. Are we so sure it's broken? Could tampering with it do more harm than good?
So the argument that tampering with it at all would sort of lead to the downfall of the internet, that's what you heard for decades in Washington. But Congress, a couple years back, actually tweaked it. They added to the list of content that platforms are actually responsible for sex trafficking posts. They sort of add a little bit to the law to address that. The internet didn't fall, and I think that gave regulators and lawmakers the thinking of, hey, we can actually mess around with this a little bit and not trigger the sort of parade of horribles that tech companies have always said was going to happen.
Ylan, what are you hearing in terms of those changes? It's interesting that this also does involve the Mexico-Canada, the new NAFTA bill, which has a version of this if it were passed, and I wonder if that's a sticking point at all.
Yeah, there is some concern amongst lawmakers that was brought up today that these types of principles could be exported to other countries, that there is a version of this that is included in the new USMCA. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle said that they don't like that being in there. They had hoped that the U.S. Trade Ambassador would come testify today. He did not, and some of them were kind of miffed and took that as a little bit of a sign of dismissiveness that their concerns aren't being heard.
And Nancy, do you think at a time when people are really piling on big tech, would these changes, you think, take away, and are they meant to take away some of their market power, or would it actually enhance it because all of a sudden new entrants are, it's a tougher field for them, maybe for smaller players too?
Arguably the latter. That's, smaller companies, the argument is that they don't have the lawyers that you mentioned. They don't have the resources to hire staff to do some of this moderation. So they might not get off the ground in the same way that they may have under the old version of Section 230. We don't hear those voices that much in Washington, right? You mentioned Reddit, Google, they're testifying. We don't hear that often from smaller companies, so their voices are a little bit missing from this debate.